I thank you for coming out on a cold, blustery evening to talk about issues of great importance for us. A 5-year war in Iraq, a 7.5-year war in Afghanistan, torture, prisons, secret prisons, not so secret prisons, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib. Today on the news it says the U.S. military has finally decided that perhaps holding 29,000 detainees in Iraq is not the way you make friends in Iraq, and they're going to be releasing tens of thousands of them that have been held, many of them. The average time of detention in Iraq is over a year, and 99% of the people held in detention are never charged with anything. How about eavesdropping? 5 years that we now know that our government has been eavesdropping on us. The government itself asks the communications companies of our country, we know what we're going to ask you to do is illegal, but you know, it's for our national security. Please play along with us. And they did, all of them but Qwest. Qwest was the only communications company that said to the government, we know what the law is, and you're asking us, you the government are asking us to break the law, and we're not going to do it. So what happens with that? Good for Qwest, except now the CEO of Qwest is under investigation by the federal government. Who knows what the charges are, but I would expect it's probably obstruction of government criminal activity. Okay, what? Yeah, okay, and now we have the administration that says, okay, we did ask you to do something illegal, and you did the illegal thing, so two illegals must make a legal, and let's give immunity for that criminal action. And so the Senate voted for immunity. It was the House of Representatives, first time the House of Representatives, now headed by the Democrats, have stood up to anything, in my opinion. And at least the Democrats said, no, we're not going to vote for immunity. And that's when the Republicans of the House of Representatives walked out of the Capitol. Well, I hope we see a lot more walkouts of the Capitol. I hope we have a little spine and backbone in those Democrats so that in the next 6 weeks when we see a supplemental budget for war, of course it's not part of our normal budget, it's not a part of the budgeting cycle, it's a brand new budget to supplement, to pay for the war that's now cost how many trillions of dollars, the war that's costing how many billions of dollars every single day?
3 trillion it's going to be.
3 trillion.
We're spending
$3 trillion.
For each Iraqi person we have murdered.
$3 million for each Iraqi person. Thank you.
$3
million.
million apiece.
Thank you. These are the statistics we need to know, and we need to be able to put them right back to our U.S. congressional delegation to say we do not want you to fund that war. Of course we want to support the troops. I mean, they're the pawns in all of this. They're the ones that join the military and hoping and praying that they don't get an administration that sends them into an illegal war. They're praying that the civilians of their country will put the stop to something like that. They're depending on us. We do want to support them, but we don't want to support those policies that are illegal. The invasion and occupation of an oil-rich Arab Muslim country that has not attacked the United States. That's what we want to stop. So it's up to us. The Congress is the group that will stop that, and we've got to put some backbone in them. With the election coming up in November, of course, the Democrats will say, as they have told us, if we have gone to them to say, you were elected in November of 2006 for 2 reasons. One's to stop the war, because 70% of the American public says the war has to end. Of course, 80% of the public of Iraq says that the United States should leave Iraq. The war needs to end, and we need to have accountability. We need to have investigations that could lead to the impeachment of the president, vice president, and everybody else. So what do Nancy Pelosi and John Conyers have to say about that? Well, 400 of us went to John Conyers' office in July of last summer, July of 2007. 400 of us sat in the hallways around Conyers' office, the head of the House Judiciary Committee. 47 of us went into his office. We sat there and said, we are not going to leave until you say impeachment is back on the table. We waited and we waited. Actually, we talked to him for about an hour and a half, and then he said, you know, Winning the '08 election is more important for the Democrats than ending the war in Iraq, and more important than impeachment. And at that point, we knew that we were going to be arrested because we weren't going to leave. We were going to protest. And indeed, 47 of us were arrested in his office that afternoon. But what audacity. The head of the House, the Democrats of the House, the head of the Judiciary Committee telling us, the people of America, that thank you very much, but John Conyers and Nancy Pelosi will tell you what part of the Constitution you can have. And indeed, they are essentially telling us that little word called impeachment, mentioned 7 times in our Constitution, is not part of our Constitution anymore, because those 2 people, have determined that we will not use it. Well, I say to John Conyers and Nancy Pelosi that you're wrong. You're wrong. And there's plenty of time even now, with only 6 months left. Well, there's actually more than that. January of 2009 is when the inauguration takes place. And even after the election in '08, there's plenty of time to impeach somebody. I think we need to do that. Yeah, get those impeachment signs up. I mean, I was at I was at an event in Detroit, Michigan, back last summer, and Detroit, Michigan is where John Conyers is from, and Conyers had been invited to this presentation, and there were 700 or 800 people at that, and all of them were bringing in impeachment signs. Well, the focus of the program was supposed to be on getting us out of Iraq, and the organizers of it were saying to everybody who was bringing in these impeachment signs, you can't bring those in. That's not what we're talking about tonight. We are just not doing that. We're doing the war on Iraq. And there were hundreds of people with these signs, and fortunately there were plenty of TV cameras that were outside, and so all the impeachment people just went over to the TV cameras and said, they're not letting us in. They're not letting us in. Well, the organizers very quickly started letting all those impeachment signs in. And when John Conyers got up to speak, every speaker before him had been talking about impeachment and about his statement to us in July, we won't impeach. Every other speaker had been talking about it. And when John Conyers got up there, the whole crowd erupted. There were so many signs. John Conyers there then said, oh, well, I never really did say we wouldn't maybe have impeachment. He's talking over both sides of his mouth, tragically. Okay, well, enough about that. Now, how about what's happening in the world today? Just yesterday, a new Department of Defense report was issued by part of the National Defense University, the Institute of Strategic Studies of the National Defense University. And they're now calling, this is a Pentagon-funded Department of Defense institute, is now saying that the war in Iraq is a debacle. If you haven't read that report, do download it. It's a fascinating document. It's taken from people, interviews from people who are a part of the planning process of the war and the implementers of this war. They're finally saying it is a debacle. The president, the vice president haven't said that at all. General Petraeus is not saying that, as we know from last week in his presentation with Ambassador Crocker in Washington. They are still saying that the surge is working, that indeed the extra 30,000 military troops that were brought in last year, that they have indeed reduced the violence. Well, I would say that the things that our congressmen and women really didn't focus too much on when they were questioning them was, how much money are we paying off all of these groups that are getting really millions of dollars and lots of ammunition to be these neighborhood councils, these awakening councils, these neighborhood patrol groups that are now the ones that are patrolling ethnically cleansed neighborhoods, ethnically cleansed as a part of U.S. policies. U.S. policies of putting up walls. There are models that are being used here. The walls that are being put up around the United States of America down on our southern border, and those same companies that are putting those walls up are getting contracts to put up walls in Baghdad and walls in other cities of Iraq to keep ethnic groups apart. Ethnic groups who were never fighting each other really, other than Saddam going after the Kurds, but ethnic groups that were intermarried, but now they are split apart, violently split apart. And the solution is that, yeah, we'll make sure they're permanently split apart. Just on the news tonight when we were driving in on Democracy Now!, they were saying that the southern part, or one part of Sadr City is now being cleansed, that people are being pushed out of it, and there will be a big wall built through the middle of Sadr City. And the reason for that is that the green zone continues to get hit every single day with multiple 10, 20, 30, 40 mortars and missiles every day. And 2 weeks ago was the greatest number that have ever hit, and day after day just getting pounded and pounded and pounded, to the extent that all the employees in the green zone, all the old State Department employees, and now in the largest embassy the United States has in the whole world, they were ordered to stay inside. Don't go outside. Stay behind the big, thick walls of that embassy, because here we have the largest military in the world. Well, maybe we're not the largest, but we're certainly we have the most firepower, the United States of America. And we cannot protect an embassy. We cannot protect it from homemade missiles, from mortars that are moving around the city in little cars, maybe on donkey carts. We have a situation where the United States of America has a big target painted right over it. The U.S. presence in Baghdad has a big bullseye painted on it, and people from all over the city of Baghdad are seeing if they can hit the bullseye. So the way to stop that is to move those people back, move them back further, and then build a wall. So maybe that'll make sure that they don't quite have the same aiming power into the green zone. Just a couple of days ago, another notice saying that all U.S. State Department employees will be subject to going to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Boy, that's a real morale booster, isn't it? Yeah, a real morale booster. A lot of people that are in the State Department are saying, thank you very much. I joined to represent the United States, but I didn't want to represent it in this way. The same way that we have a lot of our military folks. The book, Dissent, Voices of Conscience, that I and my co-author Susan Dixon wrote, details a story of people who joined the government, but they didn't join it to participate in what they believe are illegal or criminal actions. Men and women of our military who volunteered to go into our military forces for the defense of our country, but not to go invade and occupy another country that had done nothing to us, particularly a country in the Middle East where the United States is not particularly well liked, mainly because of what is the perception or reality of unbalanced policies of not just this administration, but continuous U.S. administrations on the Israeli-Palestinian issues. Men and women of our military who have taken an oath to defend the country or defend the Constitution, not necessarily to defend any particular administration or its policies. That might be arguable, but we have men and women who are saying, and in a very dramatic way, who are saying, I will not go to Iraq or I will not go back to Iraq. You have in your own community Lieutenant Aaron Watada, the first commissioned officer who's refused to go to Iraq. He was court-martialed for his principled stand, his analysis of what the war in Iraq was. He, after reading lengthy legal opinions on whether or not the war in Iraq was authorized, was just, was permitted by international law, permitted in terms of getting the authorization of the UN Security Council for military operations, or being military operations to repel an imminent attack on your own country. And he said the war in Iraq does not meet any of those two criteria, and he refused to deploy to Iraq and was court-martialed in February of last year, a court-martial that ended in a mistrial that has now gone to the federal court. The federal courts have said to the Army that you cannot court-martial him again unless you make a ruling on whatever charges you decide to bring against him. You've got to make a ruling on whether or not they constitute double jeopardy. Are you charging him with the same thing? You've got to formally say whether these charges are that or not. So here it's been now another 6 months since the ruling came down from the federal courts, and Lieutenant Watada is still waiting for the military to make its decision. I think what's happening there is that they are, since Aaron Watada has not been making a lot of public statements, as he did back in the spring preceding his court-martial, or the spring and summer. I think he's said plenty, don't you? He doesn't need to make any more statements. That young lieutenant has said enough for all of us about our concerns about this war in Iraq. I hope what's happening is the military is saying, well, we'll just let this ride for a while. And if the lieutenant doesn't publicly make any more statements, maybe we can go ahead and discharge him. Maybe we can let him serve out his commitment, military commitment, and we won't bring charges. I hope that's what the military is doing. I think that would be an equitable solution to this. The military is going to not come out looking good on this one, I don't believe. And I would urge the military to really consider first, well, the image of the U.S. military, as well as you know, a lieutenant who has the nerve, who has the courage, who has the conscience to bring into question some things that I suspect a lot of very senior officers were questioning, but didn't have the nerve to say anything. Some of the people that we profile, besides Aaron Watada in our book, are a couple of the other generals, or a couple of other military, to include some generals in the Army. What if you were a four-star general and you were asked to come before the Congress and asked to comment on whether or not the war plans that were in place for the war in Iraq, the war plans that have been developed by Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, are these war plans adequate to meet the obligations of an occupying power? You know, when one country invades another country, you do assume some responsibilities. As an occupier under international law, under the Geneva Conventions, you assume the responsibilities of the government. So you're in charge of the security and safety of the civilian population. You're in charge of food, shelter, water, electricity, health care. You're supposed to prevent looting. You're supposed to protect the treasures, the museums, all those things, because you're now in charge. Well, when General Eric Shinseki, four-star general, Army general, Chief of Staff of the Army, was asked that in the fall of 2002, are those war plans that the Pentagon has, are they adequate to meet those obligations that the United States will have when it occupies Iraq? And General Shinseki said, no, we don't have enough people in the war plans. We lack several 100,000 people. Well, what happened to him? Donald Rumsfeld, whose theory and philosophy was, we're going to go into Baghdad lean and mean. We don't need many people. We'll have high technology helping us. Those drones will come in with us. And besides, my Iraqi exiles, my friends from the exile community, Ahmed Chalabi, he's given me assurances that we're going to be met with flowers, that indeed we will be called the liberators, not the occupiers. Well, it didn't happen. We weren't called the liberators. And in fact, General Shinseki knew exactly what he was talking about. But he had crossed the wrong person when he told the Congress under oath what his professional military opinion was, that we lack several 100,000 people. General Shinseki was shunned by Donald Rumsfeld from that day forward. He essentially was pulled out of the chain of command, and for the remaining year he had as Chief of Staff of the Army, he was sidelined from all of the decision-making processes. That's what Donald Rumsfeld did. And this report that I mentioned earlier that came out from the National Defense University that has called the war in Iraq a debacle has also taken Donald Rumsfeld to task for micromanagement of the war, for taking units off the computerized list that the military has, that you just kind of punch in an operation and it tells you how many units it's going to take to do all of the things that need to be done, from the fighting forces in the front to all the logistics forces that follow behind. And Donald Rumsfeld was using his little grease pencil just to mark off units, mark off units, mark off units. He was determining who was going to be going in, sidelining all of the professional military who knew how to put operations together. So General Shinseki was one of the very first victims of Donald Rumsfeld, but there were others that came in. Others, for example, after we got into Iraq and we started detaining a lot of people, imprisoning them, and we ended up with 17 prisons in Iraq. And one of the most infamous now we know is Abu Ghraib. And we've seen those photographs of sexual humiliation, of people who were put in stress positions, tortured, probably waterboarded, that being now one of the national policies of the United States, since the President of the United States vetoed the law sent to him by Congress that said that torture was illegal, and the President of the United States vetoes that law, giving the CIA clear permission for their enhanced interrogation techniques to include waterboarding. And an attorney general of our country who, in his confirmation hearings, refused to say that waterboarding was torture, and to this day has continued to characterize waterboarding as torture. He just doesn't know. I suggest there's one way for him to find out. And in fact, about every 2 weeks, there's a demonstration of waterboarding or water drowning, it really is what it is, that takes place out in front of the Justice Department. There are men and women who are willing to undergo that horrible experience to show others what it is like. And I would suggest that Attorney General Mukasey come down and volunteer to see what it's like to be drowning under that cascade of water, hitting paper, hitting plastic, going into your mouth. Those techniques that were being used in Abu Ghraib, the Abu Ghraib prison that, well, how did we find out about Abu Ghraib? It appeared in the New Yorker magazine and on 60 Minutes, and that's when we first knew about it. But how in the world, how did it get to them? Well, it started out with one of the sergeants, Sergeant Grainer, that was one of the guards down, one of the chief guards down in one wing of that prison. He was taking photographs of things they were doing down there, and he brought them one day to a specialist, Joe Darby. Hey, Darby, take a look at this CD. We've got some real photographs of what we do down in our wing of the prison. And Darby took them and put them in his computer and started looking at them and thought, oh my God, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. This is not what we're trained to do. This is bad, nasty stuff that's going on. So he took that CD over to his criminal investigative division of his unit, and he said, guys, you better take a look at this because I think there's some bad stuff going on down in Grainer's wing of the prison. And the CID looked at it and agreed with him, and slowly that CD started moving up a chain of command, and the various leaders on up the chain of command heard about it, kept passing it up, and somehow Seymour Hersh heard about it. 60 Minutes got a copy of that CD, and we started seeing the pictures of it. And then the Secretary of Defense had to respond to the 60-minute show, and he was asked in a press conference at the Pentagon, a press conference that was seen in the United States, but also seen around the world on CNN International. Mr. Secretary of Defense, what are you doing about this scandal in Abu Ghraib? What are you doing to prevent this torture, these abuses that are going on? And Donald Rumsfeld, in his own way. Well, you know, we're investigating this, and we're trying to get to the bottom of it. You know, there are always a few bad apples in every barrel. But, you know, we have to thank for this Specialist Joe Darby. He's the one that let us know about this. Well, in Abu Ghraib prison, watching the television of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld giving his press conference was Joe Darby sitting at the cafeteria at the table, sitting there and listening to his name being mentioned, to the identification by the Secretary of Defense of a person that had blown the whistle on conduct that Donald Rumsfeld himself had authorized. So he was calling out Joe Darby, calling him out right there on international news. Well, it was working too, because seated at that table with Joe Darby were members of Grainer's team that was down in that wing of the prison. Hey, Darby, you rat, what are you doing? You ratted on us. You're squealing on us. Well, Darby knew his days were numbered. So Darby went on to his commanding officer to say, I think you'd better get me out of here, because the Secretary of Defense has mentioned me as a part of letting people know what was going on in the prison. And the commanding officer said, yep, you better get out of here. And so they sent him out. They flew him out the next day. But they didn't send him home, because his family at his home in West Virginia was already getting death threats from the people, the family of the people that were at the table, because those people knew they were already they were under investigation. So Darby's family was already getting death threats from the families back at home. Darby was then sent to another military base where he was put under protective custody, and now he's out of the military, but he is under federal protective custody. He has a new identity. He lives in a place not anywhere close to where his home is. That's what happens when you cross somebody like Donald Rumsfeld, somebody who has authorized criminal actions by our government. How about if you were in charge of procurement? I mean, all these big contracts that have been going on where we have spent trillions of dollars in Iraq. And so the story goes, we aren't getting much for our money. There are a lot of contractors who have taken the money and haven't left much behind. A lot of people that were supposed to be building schools and clinics that really didn't do much, if anything. They got sole source contracts, billion-dollar contracts. In fact, one of the very first ones that was to a company formerly headed by the Vice President of the United States. Dick Cheney's Halliburton got one of, and still continues to get, the biggest contracts that our government issues. And what if you were the chief of procurement of a major military organization, the Army Corps of Engineers, and you were in charge of all contracting for the Army Corps of Engineers, and the three-star general in charge of the Corps of Engineers comes to you and says, Bunnateen Greenhouse, we're changing the way we're doing things. We've just gotten some information from the White House that we need to be doing some fast contracting to support those troops in Iraq. We need to make sure that big companies start moving quickly on all of the things that they have to do to support those troops. And we're going to do sole source contracts. And here are the companies we're going to give those contracts to. Halliburton, KBR, Parsons, all of whom have ties to various officials in the administration. And Bunnateen Greenhouse, who is a senior executive service official, equivalent to like a general in the civil service. And she'd been working for the Army Corps of Engineers for many, many years and was the top contracting officer. And she said, we can't do that. We've got rules. We've got regulations. Because there's been fraud, waste, and abuse in past years, we know what happens when you do sole source contracting. We can't do that. And she's told, you will do this. And she says, I will not do this. And her boss says, well, you're fired. And she says, well, you can't fire me. I'm in the civil service. It takes more than just you to fire me. And she starts calling in all of the other chiefs of the Army Corps of Engineers that she's worked for in the past, telling them what she's being ordered to do. And they put pressure on the current general, saying, you can't do that. And why are you? We have regulations in place for times of crisis that we can expedite sending out requests for proposals, for bids for these contracts that we need. We know the organizations in the United States that are capable of fulfilling these contracts. We can get these RFPs out there and get the information back, and then we can make a decision. We can have a choice so that we can maybe save those taxpayers some money. A competitive bidding process even in time of war. They were told, no, we're not doing it. We're giving these contracts now to Halliburton. Well, if you were Bonatine Greenhouse, what do you do? Well, Bonatine said, I'm hanging on. I'm not going to get fired. And she told him when they said, you better retire. She said, I'm not going to retire. You'd better resign. No, I'm not going to resign. I'm staying right here. They demoted her and demoted her, gave her terrible fitness ratings. She's hanging on. She's still in the Army Corps of Engineers. She testifies before Congress. She's one of the ones that the Congress always calls to testify as a whistleblower, because she's still, even though she sits now in a tiny little office, she's still in the Army Corps of Engineers, and there are a lot of people that are horrified in that organization about what's happened. And they keep feeding Bonatine Greenhouse all sorts of information about what's going on. And so every 3 or 4 months, the Congress calls her back. In fact, I saw her just a couple of months ago in the halls of Congress. She had just finished testifying at one more round of what's going on in the world of contracting and what contractors are not performing according to the contracts and what contracts are being issued as sole source bids. You look at the number of contractors we have in Iraq right now. We have more contractors in Iraq than we have military. We have 160,000 military in Iraq and 180,000 contractors. So, one of the questions to ask all of these folks that are running for president, we always think, how fast can you move the troops out of Iraq? Well, we asked 2 of them that. The other one, he's not moving any troops out of Iraq. But we forget to ask, what are you going to do about the civilians? What about those contractors, those 75,000 private security contractors, those contractors that have virtually as much firepower, weaponry, helicopters, armored carriers as our military has? Those firms called Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp, that are mercenaries, that are being paid with our tax money. We are hiring mercenaries to augment our U.S. military in Iraq. So really we should be counting not just 160,000 military, add another 75,000, and it comes up to 230,000 people that have weapons in Iraq. And then another 100,000 that are civilians. So now you're up to close to 400,000 people that we are paying for in Iraq. 14 military bases, huge bases, permanent bases, bases that are actually American cities that are there, that have Starbucks, that have Pizza Hut. What are we going to do about those? A huge amount of equipment that's in there. After Gulf War I, over 500,000 Americans were a part of Gulf War I. Gulf War I to push Saddam Hussein out of that postage stamp size country that he had invaded, that country of Kuwait. And under authorization of the UN Security Council, the international community mounted a force, and the United States put in 500,000 people to push him out of Kuwait. It was a 100-hour ground war, preceded, of course, by many, many days of bombing of various cities in Iraq by U.S. aircraft. But 100 hours on the ground. Do you have any idea how long it took to move out the equipment for just that 100-hour war? Over 2 years. Can you imagine how much, now that we've been in Iraq 5 years, we've had over 1.5 million military that have gone in and out of Iraq, 14 permanent bases that are truly cities. How long will it take to remove all of that? A long, long time. Yeah, you could give it to the Iraqis, and I hope that's what happens. I hope that all of that, I mean, here you go, the franchises. I hate to wreck that upon their culture, though, that they start getting Starbucks and a head start on Pizza Hut and all of the American corporate fast food organizations. But the United States has moved an incredible amount of personnel and equipment into Iraq. Our book, Dissent, Voices of Conscience, not only profiles Americans, but they also profile members of other governments who have spoken out against their government's role in the war in Iraq. The British government, the George Bush's lapdog, as the British press called their Prime Minister Tony Blair, for going along with George Bush. We know when the involvement started with the British government through what's called the Downing Street memos. The memos that detail the meetings that took place back in March and April and May of 2002, while we had just barely gotten into Afghanistan, already the Bush administration was making contact with the British government saying, we're going to take out Saddam and we want you to come with us. And the British government officials, their Minister of Defense, their equivalent, their MI5 head, equivalent of the CIA, director of the CIA, their British ambassador, writing up the memorandum of their discussions with U.S. officials. And these memorandum now called the Downing Street memos, all identifying that, yeah, Bush is going to go in, they're going into Iraq, they want us to come with us, but there's no legal basis for Great Britain to have a war on Iraq. The Iraqis haven't attacked us, and we don't have the intelligence that says, the information that says that there are weapons of mass destruction, that there is a threat to international security. And in those memos it says we're going to have to fix the security, fix the intelligence, in order to come up with a justification, a legal justification to go in there. What if you were a British diplomat, a deputy legal advisor to the British Foreign Service? You had been giving consistent advice since these memorandums started coming in, saying there is no legal basis for the British government to invade and occupy Iraq. And indeed, for us to do that would be an act of aggression, which is a war crime. And you, senior members of the British government that ordered that, could be held accountable in the International Criminal Court. And indeed, that was exactly what Elizabeth Willemshurst, the deputy legal advisor of the British Foreign Service, had been telling Tony Blair for over a year before the war in Iraq started. She ended up resigning in March of 2003, the same month that I resigned. Her letter of resignation did not become public for over a year. When it did become public, she also had in there that one other reason she was resigning, that besides the government ignoring the consistent legal advice of all of the legal agencies of Great Britain, was that the Attorney General of Great Britain, Lord Goldsmith, who had also concurred in this legal evaluation that it would be an illegal war, had 10 days before the war started changed his mind. Now, why do you think he changed his mind 10 days before the war? Tony Blair putting a little pressure on him, saying, Goldsmith, if you don't give me the legal opinion that protects me when I order us to war, I'm firing you. So either give me that opinion or get out of the way. Well, Goldsmith turned. Goldsmith then changed his legal opinion. And in fact, there's some recent documents that have now come out of the British government, out of their archives, that really detail his change and how he justified the British decision to go into the war. But that was one of the things that made Elizabeth Willemshurst resign, that indeed the legal advice had been ignored by her government, and so she resigned. That letter became known to us through another person who had issue with the British government. This was a young lady, a 24-year-old, a spy, a listener, a person that listened in on other people's conversations, similar to our National Security Agency. They call it the General Communications Headquarters in Great Britain. Catherine Gunn had worked only a short time for the General Communications Headquarters, but she knew the regulations that they were supposed to work by, that you spy on some people, but you don't listen in on other people. And when her boss came to her and gave her some emails saying, we've been asked by the U.S. government to listen in on the conversations of the member states of the UN Security Council to find out whether or not they're going to vote for military operations on Iraq. And if they're not going to vote for them, the United States government, the Bush administration, is really going to put the heavy hand on them. They're going to take all of their economic assistance funds away from them and their military assistance funds. They're going to threaten them with all of that to make them vote for military operations on Iraq. So we need to help them find out who's not going to vote for it. And Catherine Gunn said, but we have regulations that say we're not supposed to listen in on those conversations of the people the countries that are on the UN Security Council. And her boss said, we're changing those regulations. And she essentially said, well, you better put it in writing because I know what the rules are. And the chief said, nope, I'm not putting it in writing, just do it. Well, what would you do? I mean, you're a brand new person to the organization, first job out of college. What do you do when, the world's almost ready to go to war and you're being told you're a key part of this and our government needs for you to do this illegal thing, but do it anyway because we need to help the U.S. and putting the screws to some other countries. Well, Catherine Gunn, as young as she was, said, I don't think that's right. So she Xeroxed copies of those emails. Xerox copies of them, and she sent them to several newspapers in Great Britain, and they published them. And in Great Britain, it was a big to-do that the U.S. government, the Bush administration, asked Tony Blair to help listen in on these conversations so that Bush could put the heavy hand on some of these countries. Now, did you all read about that? Did you read about that when that happened? A couple of you did. Most of the American public, you must have like the BBC listed on your favorites thing or something, that most Americans never heard of that. That indeed the Bush administration had been blackmailing countries, really, saying, if you don't vote for this military operation, we will take your economic assistance funds away from you. Well, what happens to a person like Catherine Gunn who stands up and says, I think we're doing illegal things and our government's not supposed to do that, and I'm going to let other people know about it. Well, Catherine Gunn was charged with violating the Official Secrets Act of Great Britain. She was fired from her job, she was arrested, she was brought to court on charges of violating that act. And the potential prison sentence was long for Catherine Gunn. Well, she had defense attorneys, and for a year they prepared her case. The night before the case was to go to trial, the British government dropped the case. Now, why would that be? Well, turned out that the defense attorneys had gotten some very interesting documents. Interesting documents that the British government did not want to have disclosed. And one of those documents was the resignation letter of Elizabeth Williamshurst. The resignation letter that said, I, as the Deputy Legal Counsel of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, resigned because the legal advice being given to Tony Blair by all legal agencies was ignored, and the man is committing an act of aggression, a war crime. Well, the defense attorneys had that letter and showed it to the prosecution and said, do you guys want this in the newspaper tomorrow? And the prosecution decided that maybe maybe it was better to go ahead and drop that case against Catherine Gunn. So they did. But guess what appeared in the British newspapers about 4 weeks later? That letter of resignation. And that's when we started finding out that indeed many people in the British government, the legal advisors of the British government had been warning Tony Blair, you'd better not go into this war because there's no legal basis for it. You know, there were 3 of us that resigned from the U.S. government over the war in Iraq, but the British government had 4 times as many that resigned. They had 12 to 15 people that resigned. And the most senior person of all of the governments of the world that resigned over the Iraq war was from Britain. And interestingly enough, he was the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the British government under Tony Blair, under Blair's first administration. His name was Robin Cook. You probably remember him. I mean, he was very famous in British politics. After he finished one term with Tony Blair, he went in to be the head of the majority party in the Houses of Parliament. And as the head of the majority party, he resigned over the Iraq war. And his statement of resignation given to the Houses of Parliament is a very moving statement, and it's one that we do include in this book. It is the only time in the history of the British Parliament, in the 700-year history of the British Parliament, that anyone has been given a standing ovation. When Robin Cook resigned. The next second highest official to resign in opposition to the war in Iraq was also from Great Britain. Her name was Claire Short. She was their Secretary of International Aid. And she was going to resign before the war started, but Tony Blair came to her and said, please don't resign, because I'm going to make sure that the reconstruction of Iraq is done not by the Americans. I mean, it's going to be too contentious. They're the ones that are leading the charge to invade and occupy, so we need to move the reconstruction into another organization, and I'm going to make sure it's the United Nations that is the one charged with reconstruction. And Claire Short said, well, if you can make sure it's just anyone but the Americans, then I'll stay. Well, within 3 weeks after the invasion of Iraq, we found out who was going to lead the reconstruction. It was going to be the United States of America, not the UN. Interestingly enough, it was not going to be our Agency for International Development that has done a lot of reconstruction work all over the world. It was not going to be the Department of State. It was going to be the Department of Defense. I mean, that's it. You go in, tear it up, and then you rebuild it. Use those soldiers for everything. Well, that's when Claire Short decided she would resign, that she would not be a part of what was going to be happening. So she became the second highest person to resign. Now, I would think that in our own government we should have had a few people resigning. I think my former boss, Secretary of State Colin Powell, ought to have resigned. He should have resigned to... He should have resigned because there was, the treatment that, he of all people knew what was going to be happening on the invasion of Iraq. He had had the most experience, Deputy National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs during Gulf War I, out of power for 8 years, out of office, but he knew the questions to ask when he came back in as Secretary of State. He gave that performance to the UN, telling us about all the information they had that should lead the United Nations to vote for war because we know those weapons of mass destruction are there. Well, the UN did not vote for military operations in Iraq. There were plenty of member states that did not agree with them. Many of people of the United States of America didn't agree with him. My estimation is that he was much more loyal to the Bush family, who appointed him to virtually everything he ever had, either George Bush the first as vice president or as president, and then George Bush the second. He was more loyal to the Bush family than to America. He knew very well what was going to happen, and he didn't take that step to say, we have to stop. And his resignation is the one thing that possibly could have stopped that. Considering his treatment, though, as Secretary of State after that, I'm not so sure maybe that's true. As Secretary of State, he was pushed aside. I was offended, even though I was already out of the government, but my God, for the State Department to be totally sidelined in all of these major policy decisions, and for him not to resign on that, leads me to believe that his state of conscience must be pretty low right now. So we have a lot of examples of people who have been conscientious in what they believe in, what their government should stand for, and some that haven't been quite so noble in their thoughts, maybe is one way to say it. I guess to kind of close this and then open it up for questions if you'd like, this book, Dissent, Voices of Conscience, has the stories of a lot of men and women in our military and in the civilian side of our government who have taken stands, most of them at great detriment to their physical and mental and financial well-being. Mine was the easiest. Resigning, that's it. I don't go to prison or anything like that. But for some of these young men and women who have said, I will not go to a war I think is illegal, and I will go to jail rather than do that. 30 of them that have done it so far. The men and women who have chosen to live in Canada rather than submit to what they feel is an illegal war. Those are people that I would say deserve our admiration and our thanks for their courage. And I hope that you think of their examples when you are faced with decisions of conscience in your own lives, because we all do have a lot of things that we confront. I hope that you will think of them. I hope you will not stop working hard to stop this war in Iraq, to prevent a war in Iran, to impeach Bush and Cheney. We've got a lot of work to do. A lot of us are very tired, but we can't stop, because if we stop, what will happen? They will win. And we cannot allow that to happen. It's our country, it's a good country, and we can make it much, much better. We need to roll back all of these criminal acts of this government and try to repair a little bit the damage that's been done to our national reputation. So with that, I want to thank you all very, very much, and peace. Thank you.